The Vietnam War stands out as one of the most controversial and impactful conflicts of the 20th century. What started as a conflict between North Vietnam against South Vietnam quickly snowballed into a battle of ideologies, strategies, and wills between the communist forces and the United States. What is often overshadowed in the grand narrative of the entire war is the horrible nature of the war and the long-term damages soldiers took from it, not just physically, but also psychologically. While the United States had advanced weaponry and superior firepower, the Viet Cong leveraged guerrilla warfare techniques, especially with their complex trap systems, in an attempt to win the war. For the Viet Cong, it felt like a classic case of David versus Goliath, where the knowledge of the local terrain and sheer creativity gave the underdog a slight edge. As the Viet Cong was ready to defend territory and ideology at all costs, they invented some of the most horrifying traps ever seen to men. Welcome to Past Perspectives, and today we are taking a look at the scariest traps used in the Vietnam War. Together, we will uncover the remarkable strategies behind these traps and the immense challenges they gave the US and South Vietnam during the war. But before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to Past Perspectives so you can learn about all the history topics that have never been talked about in school. The Viet Cong, or often referred to as the VC, emerged in the late 1950s as a communist-led guerrilla force with the goal to fight against the South Vietnamese government. It didn't take long, and they gained more and more members, and by the 1960s, the Viet Cong had grown tremendously in size and became a thorn inside the South Vietnamese army and even for the US military forces. However, it wasn't just the numbers or the advanced weaponry that made the Viet Cong such a feared and challenging opponent. It was their nimbleness and the strategies they employed. See, the Viet Cong faced off against a technically superior army with basically limitless resources, so they realized that they would never be able to win a conventional military confrontation. Their solution became guerrilla warfare, a form of irregular warfare in which small groups use hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and traps to combat a larger and less mobile conventional army. Today, the decision of the Viet Cong to rely on guerrilla tactics is often presented as a choice. However, for them, it was a necessity. Their options were inferior in every way you could imagine. They didn't have the same amount of men, they didn't have the same firepower, they didn't have the same technology. However, they were able to turn exactly these weaknesses into advantages. The dense jungles of Vietnam, which were often seen as a hindrance to large-scale military operations, became the Viet Cong's best ally. Their knowledge of the land, its nooks, crannies, and secrets pathways allowed them to seamlessly plant traps and disappear after strikes, leaving their adversaries bewildered and frustrated. What helped them even more was their deep connection to the local communities and the distrust locals had against the US forces. For the locals, the Viet Cong wasn't an invader. They were often seen as liberators and protectors, and therefore they had the benefit of intelligence, shelter, and resources. Now, speaking of shelter, one of the most ingenious systems the Viet Cong developed, which showcased their skills in guerrilla warfare, was the Cu Chi tunnels. These were not just simple dugouts, but evolved into veritable underground cities, serving multiple crucial roles during the war. These tunnels were a sprawling subterranean network, and given the limited resources the Viet Cong had, they were quite an architectural wonder. They spanned over 150 miles, and they were so well crafted out beneath the jungle soil that some of them even withstanding the impact of heavy bombardments. Their position was highly strategic as they were close to the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon, which allowed the Viet Cong to launch surprise attacks and after that disappear without being able to be traced back. Now, these tunnels weren't just pathways, they were practically underground cities. Looking at them today, you can see that there were kitchens, bedrooms, and even areas designated for medical care. What makes these tunnels even more impressive were the rudimentary ventilation systems, which allowed them to cook during the day and still remain unseen because no smoke was revealed. Later, the Cu Chi tunnels turned out to be one of the biggest challenges for the US forces. The Viet Cong secured these tunnels with extremely deadly traps, and they even crafted fake entrances to bait the US forces. This way, the US Army had to develop and train soldiers to become the so-called tunnel rats, a group of soldiers that have specialized in navigating and combating the Viet Cong in these tight quarters. Yet, despite their efforts, the tunnels remained largely impenetrable for them, which highlights their effectiveness. And while the Cu Chi tunnels were a testament to the Viet Cong's strategic genius, they were just one facet of their defense mechanisms. Alongside these underground labyrinths, the jungles held a more immediate and sinister danger that also showcases the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong. During the Vietnam War, they developed a range of simple but yet insanely effective traps that did not only cause physical harm, but also played a significant role in psychological warfare, as it feared the US soldiers from entering the jungle. If we just look at statistics, then traps became one of the most deadly tactics the Viet Cong has used against US soldiers, with over 64,000 American soldiers that have been affected by them. What is even more shocking is that reports have been leaked that the majority of the traps the Viet Cong has built have been crafted with material they have stolen from the United States forces. But what have actually been the most horrifying traps the Viet Cong has used against the US forces during the war? The first trap we have to look at are the infamous punji sticks. These have been one of the simplest and at the same time most notorious traps that have been used in the Vietnam War. These sticks were bamboo stakes that were sharpened, hardened, and often smeared with poison to ensure infection. These sticks were placed in pits or camouflaged areas and were waiting until an unsuspecting soldier would step or even fall into them. What's so interesting and shocking about these traps is that the more known they became, the more effective and fearsome they got, as every US soldier that wasn't known with the terrain had to watch every single step extra carefully so he wouldn't end up in one of these traps. But this wasn't the only trap that forced the soldiers to walk extra carefully through the dense jungle. Another infamous trap would be the bouncing Betty mines. Unlike traditional mines, they were designed to jump from the ground and detonate at about waist height. These traps caused severe injuries, and just like the punji sticks, they forced the soldiers to constantly be scanning the environment. However, this time it wasn't limited to the ground, but also the air around them. A lot of the time, these traps were mainly used to injure the US soldiers and to expose their positions to the nearby Viet Cong. However, the next set of traps didn't have the same intention, which are mace and snare traps. They are less famous than the punji sticks, but by far more deadly. Both of them again utilized a series of sharp objects to get tossed toward the soldiers. For example, a mace trap would often be crafted from a heavy block of wood studded with spikes. When triggered by a tripwire, it would swing down from the trees, spiking everything in its path. Another chilling example of horrifying traps used in the Vietnam War would be the booby-trapped grenades. These weren't just any grenades, they were expertly camouflaged and rigged to explode upon the slightest touch. The idea behind these grenades was to turn the American and South Vietnamese soldiers' own training against them. Typically, a soldier is trained to pick up unexploded enemy ammunition, either to use it or to secure the area. And this is what made the booby-trapped grenades so fatal. The Viet Cong would then strategically place them in the jungle and often use the natural foliage and mud to hide them, making them indistinguishable from the surroundings. There are harrowing accounts of soldiers believing they'd found unexploded enemy ammo, picking up these grenades only to be severely injured or killed when they detonated. These incidents would not only take lives and cause injuries, but also sow a deep sense of distrust among troops. Suddenly, the very act of making an area safe became a life-threatening task, contributing to the ever-present tension and fear that characterized the Vietnam War. Now, speaking of fear and tension, the longer the war went on, the less these traps were about physical harm, and the more the Viet Cong became masters of psychological warfare. Using the Cu Chi tunnels we talked about earlier, they would try to put poisonous snakes or scorpions in soldiers' boots or packs. The same went for food and water supplies, where anything left unattended might be tampered with, leading to illness or worse. But warfare tactics like this turned every item you touched, every sip of water, and every meal you ate to a potential threat. This constant state of paranoia and fear was as much a weapon as any gun or grenade. The objective was clear: wear down the enemy mentally, making them question every move and eroding their morale over time. But beyond the immediate fear and danger posed by these traps, their significance resonated in larger military strategies and shaped the way future wars would be fought. Today's military strategies across the world have taken note, and modern forces don't just prepare for direct combat, But they also trained to face guerrilla tactics and to expect the unexpected, a lesson hard learned from Vietnam. For veterans, the memories of these traps remain vivid. Whether American soldiers recounting the fear of every step, or Viet Cong veterans detailing the craft of setting up these traps, the stories are a testament to the war's profound impact on individual psyches. For many, the scars are not just physical but mental, with the echoes of the traps triggering nightmares years after the war ended. Thank you for joining us today at Past Perspectives into the most horrifying traps that have been used in the Vietnam War and the long-lasting impact they had on veterans. And please let me know in the comments which trap shocked you the most. With that being said, thanks for watching, and until next time,